The mandore is a musical instrument, a small member of the lute family, teardrop-shaped, with 4-6 courses of gut strings and pitch in the treble range. It was considered a new instrument in French music books from the 1580s, but is descended from and very similar to the gittern. It is considered ancestral to the modern mandolin. Other earlier instruments include the medieval European citole and the Greek and Byzantine pandura. The history of modern mandolins, mandolas and guitars are all intertwined. The instruments shared common ancestor instruments. Some instruments became fashionable widely, and others locally. Experts argue as to the differences, because many of the instruments are similar but not identical. Classifying them has proven difficult. Some experts consider the mandore a forerunner to the mandolino, which in turn branched out into a family of mandolins that includes the Neapolitan mandolin, the Genoese mandolin, and the Cremonese mandolin. Others consider that the mandore and mandolino may have been contemporary, with different names being used in different countries. The mandolino in Italy, the mandore in France. It is also considered a forerunner, a close relative of the 17th century mandola. Name controversy. The instrument has also been called mandora, a mandola in Italian, vandola in Spanish, and mandorgan or quintern in German. Michael Pretorius used the names mandurich and mandua, mandurin, mandurin, and pandurina, while the mandore and mandora have been considered equivalent names for the same instrument by some authors. There are authors who believe that mandora is strictly for a different kind of lute, tuned in the bass range. For an article on the bass range instruments, see mandora. The instrument has also been mistakenly called mandolin instead of mandorgan by modern readers of Pretorius's book. However, the RAN in the word is actually RGEN. The error is due to a lithographic fault in reproducing plate 16. That fault truncated the G into an A. The error can be seen when comparing two different versions of the plate. A brief history. The Cantigas de Santa Maria shows 13th century instruments similar to lutes, mandores, mandolas and guitars, being played by European and Islamic players. The instruments move from Spain northward to France and eastward towards Italy by way of Provence, beside the introduction of the lute to Spain by the Moors. Another important point of transfer of the lute from Arabian to European culture was Sicily, where it was brought either by Byzantine or later by Muslim musicians. There were singer-lutinists at the court in Palermo following the Norman conquest of the island from the Muslims, and the lute is depicted extensively in the ceiling paintings in the Palermo's Royal Cappella Palatina, dedicated by the Norman King Roger II of Sicily in 1140. His Hohenstaufen grandson Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, continued integrating Muslims into his court, including Moorish musicians. By the 14th century, lutes had disseminated throughout Italy and, probably because of the cultural influence of the Hohenstaufen kings and emperor based in Palermo, the lute had also made significant inroads into the German-speaking lands. Construction. Like the earlier gittern, the mandore's back and neck were in earlier forms carved out of a block of wood. This hollowed-out construction did still exist in the 16th century, according to James Tyler, but was becoming rare. The method was being replaced by gluing curved staves together to form back, and adding a neck and pegbox. From Mersenne, the normal length of a mandore is 11/2 of a foot long. It is built as a lute with strips of fir or other wood, cut and bent into melon shape to make a rounded back. The fingerboard is on the same plane as the soundboard, with a bridge glued onto the soundboard. Strings are secured in the pegboard in the neck, pass over the fingerboard and soundboard and are tied to a flat bridge, which is glued to the soundboard. The instrument may have as few as 4 strings or as many as 6. It could also have 4 to 6 courses of 2 strings. The sound hole was covered with the rose, either carved directly into the soundboard or glued in. Methods of playing. From Maron Messen, 1635. A musician plays the mandore with the finger at the tip of a feather between thumb and index finger are tied to one of the other fingers. Those who make perfect use of the mandore will move the pick so fast over the strings that they seem to form even chords as they would be if played at the same time. Another early 17th century author, Michael Praetorius, agreed. He said, they play either with a chiton-type quill plectrum, or with one finger, and this with the speed, clarity, and precision that we would expect from the use of 3 or 4 fingers. There are some players, however, who start to use 2 or more fingers once they are familiar with the instrument. Tuning. According to Praetorius, Michael Praetorius detailed 4 tunings for the mandore in his book Syntagma Musicum in 1619. He listed 3 tunings for tuning the mandore. His tuning illustrates tuning for both 4-stringed instruments and 5-stringed instruments. Fifths and fourths. The listed tunings using fifths and fourths between strings are CG, 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 D, G, D. Fourths and fifths. The listed tuning for fourths and fifths tuning is CF, CF, C. According to Messen. Messen indicates in his book that there were many ways to tune a mandore, but 3 ways predominated: tuning in unison, tuning with a lowered string, and tuning in a third. Tuning in unison. For a 4-string mandore, Messen said, the 4th string is a fifth of the third string is at the fourth of the second, and the second at a fifth from the treble string. Quote, in other words, the mandore used a combination of fourths and fifths, the courses of strings, such as CG, CG. Tuning with a lowered string. Messen indicated that this was less common than tuning in unison. To tune this way, the treble string is lowered a tone, so to make a fourth with the third string. Quote, in other words, going from tuning CG, CG to CG, CF. Tuning in a third. In tuning a third, one lowers the treble string down a minor third, so it makes a major third with the third. An example is going from CG, CG to CG, CE. According to the Skene manuscript, the tunes in the Skene manuscript are for a mandore tuned in fourths and fifths. Dorney points out in his editing of the Skene manuscript that the tablature is written strangely, that although it is tabbed for a 4-string instrument, it is marked under the bottom line, indicating a 5-string instrument. ADADA, and also an older lute tuning in fourths. CFADG relationship to other instruments. Mandore compared to lute. Maron Messen ends his section on the mandore in his book Harmonia Universal by saying, it is nothing but an abbreviated lute. Quote, he said this in the context that one could look at his section on the lute for applicable information. Lutes were larger than mandores, which Messen described as miniature. Lutes had more courses of strings and were not restricted to the high treble range, but could play into the bass range. Earlier in the section he compared the lute to the mandore. Now although the mandore has only 4 strings, nevertheless one plays it rather above all that is played in a lute, whose chorus it covers because of the liveliness and sharpness of its tone, which penetrates and so preoccupies the ear that the lutes have trouble being heard. Quote, he said that good mandore players were prone to speedy picking, blurring notes together in a rush of speed. Mandore compared to treble lute. Mandores and treble lutes were tuned differently. Treble lutes from the 16th and early 17th centuries had 6 or more courses of strings, tuned to a fourth, a major third, a fourth, Though a member of the lute family, it has been said that the mandore was not a treble lute, which had 6 or more courses and was tuned the same way as mainstream lutes. Mandore compared to mandola and mandolino. To a layman, images of the mandola and mandore show no obvious differences when comparing two instruments from the same time period. One visible difference was that the mandola and mandolino commonly use double courses of strings, where illustrations of the mandore commonly show single strings. A less visible difference was in the tuning. The Italian mandola and smaller mandolino were tuned entirely in fourths, the mandola using EADG. The French mandore used combinations of fourths and fifths such as CG, CG, CF, CF. As the instruments developed, they became physically less similar. By the 17th century, makers such as Antonio Stradivarius had two styles of instrument patterns, with the mandola having strings almost twice as long as the mandolinos. Two styles of mandolas have made it into museums: flat-backed and bowl-backed. Flat-backed mandolas resemble chitons. Bowl-backed mandolas resemble mandores. One example that has survived of a bowl-backed mandola is that made by Vicente di Verona in 1696, held by the Hungarian National Museum, Budapest, Hungary. By looks alone, telling the bowl-backed mandola from the mandore can be a challenge. Mandore compared to Neapolitan mandolin. Pictures and illustrations of the mandore show an instrument that at a casual look appears very similar to lutes and the later mandolins. The mandore differs from the Neapolitan mandolin in not having a raised fretboard and in having a flat soundboard. Also, it was strung with gut strings, attached to a bridge that is glued to the soundboard. It was played with the fingertips. In contrast, the Neapolitan mandolin's soundboard is bent. It uses metal strings attached to the end of the instrument, crossing over a bridge that pushes downwards into the bent soundboard. The differences in design reflect progress in a technological push for louder instruments. If the mandore's gut strings were tightened too much, they broke, but metal strings could pull the fixed bridge off the soundboard, or damage the soundboard. The bend in the Neapolitan soundboard let the soundboard take the pressure of metal strings, driving the bridge down into the soundboard. The result was a louder instrument with less fragile strings. The metal strings are played with a plectrum, creating even more volume. Mandolins are tuned in fifths, typically G-D-A for a 4-string mandolin. Mandore compared to bandola. Another group of related instruments to the mandore of the bandola are bandola, the bandurria and the bandolim, of Spanish origin, also played in Portugal and South America. In 1761, Joan Carlos Amat said of the bandola in his Guitarra Española, "Y bandola," and it should be noted that the bandola with 6 courses is described here, because it is the more perfect form of the instrument, and better known and more widely used at this time than that with 4 or 5 courses. Mandore compared to the Scottish mandora. A principal source of music for the Scottish variant of the instrument can be found in the Ancient Melodies of Scotland by William Dorney. This book is a history of Scottish music, and contains some information on the mandora. Dorney makes it clear that the mandora for which the tunes in the Skene manuscript are written, is the same instrument that Mersenne called the mandore. Composers: Renaissance mandore, Martin Agricola, Pierre Brunet, Adrien Leroy, Ottomar Luscius, Sebastian Verdung et al. 17th century mandore, François de Chancy, Henri-François de Galet, Valentin Strobel, Maîtrise von François Pierre Goy et al. 18th century mandora, Johann Georg Albrechtsberger, Giuseppe Antonio Brescianello, Johann Paul Schiffelholz et al.